You might not be losing your faith. You might finally be seeing what it really is, because no one tells you what happens the night you pray and feel absolutely nothing, not peace, not comfort, not even the faint sense that anyone is listening, just silence. Heavy, unmoving silence. And in that silence, a question starts to grow slow and terrifying. If I don't feel God, do I even have faith at all? Most people have been taught without anyone ever saying it out loud that real faith feels strong, alive, emotional, even powerful. That when your faith is healthy, your heart will burn, your prayers will feel electric, and your worship will move you. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when the music plays and everyone else seems lifted, but you feel like you're standing outside of it, watching something you can't enter anymore? Ethan knows that feeling. He's 34, a husband, a father, sitting alone in his truck after work, the engine off, the world quiet. A worship song plays softly through the speakers, one that used to move him, used to bring him to tears, but now it just passes over him like background noise. And the more he notices it, the worse it gets. Because now it's not just that he feels nothing, it's that he's starting to feel afraid of what that nothing might mean. He replays the question again and again. What if something's wrong with me? What if my faith is fading and I didn't even notice when it started? So he does what many people do. He tries harder. He sings louder. He prays longer. He reaches for a feeling that used to come naturally, but the harder he reaches, the further it seems to slip away. And here's the part. Almost no one says clearly, if your faith depends on what you feel, then your faith will rise and fall with your emotions. It will be strong on the days you feel inspired and weak on the days you feel empty. It will feel real when your heart is warm and fake when your heart is numb. Which means your entire relationship with God becomes tied to something that was never meant to carry that weight in the first place. So the real question is not, how much do you feel? The real question is much deeper, much more unsettling, and at the same time, much more freeing. What are you actually trusting when everything inside you goes quiet? Because the Bible does something unexpected. It does not build faith on emotional intensity. It builds it somewhere far more stable and far less dependent on your inner atmosphere. And if that's true, then it means something almost shocking. It might be possible to have real, genuine, deeply rooted faith, even on the days when you feel absolutely nothing at all. Long before faith became something people associated with inner emotion, it lived in a world where trust was not a feeling, but a survival decision, a lived commitment that shaped every part of life. To understand what the Bible means by faith, you have to step out of the modern mindset, where feelings are often treated as the most reliable indicator of truth, and step into the ancient world, where a person's word could determine your future, your family, and your identity. In that world, promises were not casual and trust was not abstract. If someone gave you their word, your response was not to ask how you felt about it, but whether you would stake your life on it. Faith, in its earliest biblical sense, was not about emotional experience, but about relational reliability, about whether someone was worthy of being trusted, even when circumstances made that trust costly. This is where the Hebrew idea of faith begins to take shape, captured in a word that appears again and again throughout the Old Testament, emunah. It is often translated as faith, but its meaning is far richer than what that English word typically suggests. Emunah carries the sense of firmness, steadiness, dependability, something that holds under pressure. It is not primarily about what happens inside you emotionally. It is about whether you remain anchored when everything around you begins to shift. In fact, the word is closely related to the idea of something being structurally sound, like a pillar that does not collapse or a foundation that does not give way. When the Bible speaks of faith in this sense, it is not describing a surge of inspiration, but a kind of endurance, a quiet, persistent trust that continues even when feelings fluctuate or disappear entirely. You can see this clearly in the story of Abraham, often called the father of faith. When God calls him to leave his homeland, he is not given a detailed map, a clear timeline, or emotional reassurance at every step. He is given a promise, and that promise is not immediately fulfilled. In fact, it stretches out over years, even decades, marked by uncertainty, waiting, and moments that would challenge anyone's sense of confidence. If faith were primarily about feelings, Abraham's story would be nearly impossible to explain, because there is no indication that he moved forward with constant emotional certainty. Instead, what defines him is that he acts on God's word before he sees the outcome, that he continues walking in a direction that only makes sense if the one who spoke is trustworthy. His faith is not the absence of doubt or fear, but the decision to trust despite them, to keep moving even when the internal experience does not match the external call. This same pattern unfolds in the story of Israel as a people. After being delivered from Egypt, they enter a wilderness where survival is not guaranteed and where their circumstances often contradict the promises they have been given. Hunger, thirst, fear, and uncertainty become constant companions. And again, if faith were measured by emotional stability, this would be the moment where everything falls apart. In many ways, it does. The people complain, they panic, they question whether God has brought them out, only to abandon them. Their emotional state rises and falls with their circumstances, and it reveals something important. Feelings are deeply responsive to what we see and experience in the moment, but they are not always reliable guides to what is ultimately true. The biblical narrative does not ignore these emotional reactions, but it consistently points beyond them, calling the people back to something more stable than their shifting inner world. What becomes clear in these stories is that faith, as the Bible defines it, is not about maintaining a certain emotional atmosphere, but about holding on to a relationship grounded in trust. It is about remembering what has been said and choosing to live in light of it, even when the present moment feels disconnected from that reality. This is why so much of the Old Testament revolves around remembering what God has done, what He has promised, who He has shown Himself to be. Because when memory fades, trust becomes fragile. And when trust becomes fragile, people begin to rely more heavily on what they feel in the moment, rather than what they know to be true over time. And this is where the tension begins to build in a way that feels surprisingly modern, because while the ancient world did not elevate feelings in the same way, contemporary culture often does. The human experience of emotional fluctuation has always been present. Fear, anxiety, doubt, grief, these are not new realities. What is different is how they are interpreted. In many modern contexts, a lack of strong feeling is often interpreted as a lack of authenticity, as if something is only real if it is felt intensely. But the Bible does not operate with that assumption. Instead, it repeatedly shows that the moments where faith matters most are often the moments where feelings are weakest, where the internal sense of certainty is absent, and where the only thing left to hold on to is the character of the one who has spoken. This becomes especially clear in the prophetic writings, where faith is often called for in seasons of instability, collapse, and unanswered questions. The prophet Habakkuk stands at one of these moments, looking out over a world that seems to be unraveling. Violence is increasing, justice appears to be failing, and the future looks uncertain. He does what many people do in such situations. He brings his questions directly to God. He does not hide his confusion or pretend that everything feels stable. In fact, his words are filled with tension, with a kind of raw honesty that refuses to smooth over the reality of what he sees. And yet, in the middle of that tension, something profound begins to take shape. Habakkuk is given a vision that reframes his understanding of what it means to live faithfully. He is told that the righteous shall live by his faith, a statement that has echoed through centuries of biblical interpretation. But within its original context, it is not a call to generate a certain emotional state. It is a call to remain steady, to continue trusting, even when the visible world does not provide immediate confirmation that such trust is justified. It is a call to live anchored in something deeper than the present moment, something that does not fluctuate with changing circumstances. And this is what makes the statement so powerful. It places the center of faith not in the intensity of feeling, but in the endurance of trust. By the time you reach the end of Habakkuk's reflection, the emotional landscape has not necessarily been resolved in the way we might expect. The external situation has not dramatically improved. The questions have not all been answered. And yet there is a shift, not because everything now feels good, but because something more stable has been grasped. He speaks of rejoicing, even if the fig tree does not blossom, even if there is no fruit on the vines. even if the fields produce no food. These are not hypothetical inconveniences. They are images of real loss, real hardship, real uncertainty. And still he describes a posture of trust that is not dependent on those outcomes. This is where the ancient biblical understanding of faith begins to confront modern assumptions in a direct and uncomfortable way, because it suggests that faith is not proven by how strongly you feel in favorable conditions, but by whether you remain anchored when those conditions disappear. It suggests that the absence of emotional reinforcement does not automatically indicate the absence of faith, and that in some cases, it may actually reveal a deeper form of it, one that is not sustained by internal experience, but by a commitment to trust the character of God, even when that character is not immediately felt. And if that is true, then the question that began to surface in Ethan's truck, that quiet, unsettling question about whether his lack of feeling means a lack of faith, begins to take on a different shape, because maybe the absence of emotion is not the end of faith, but the place where its true nature becomes visible. Maybe the silence is not evidence that something has gone wrong, but an invitation to discover whether trust can exist without the support of feeling. And as the story continues, the Bible will not move away from this tension. Instead, it will move deeper into it, especially in one of the most emotionally raw sections of Scripture, where people bring every kind of feeling, fear, anger, confusion, even despair, directly into their relationship with God. And yet somehow, in the middle of all of it, faith remains. If the story of Abraham and the voice of the prophets begin to show that faith is not rooted in emotional consistency, the Psalms take that truth and press it into the most personal, most vulnerable parts of human experience. Because here the Bible does something many people don't expect. It doesn't suppress emotion, it gives it a voice. It doesn't pretend that faith removes fear or confusion or sorrow. It places those emotions directly into conversation with God, and in doing so, it reveals something critical. Faith is not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let feeling have the final word. The Psalms are not written from a place of constant peace. They are written from caves, from battlefields, from sleepless nights, from moments of betrayal and exhaustion. They are filled with language that feels unfiltered, even uncomfortable at times, because they reflect real human reactions to real circumstances. One moment, the writer is praising God with confidence and joy, and the next, they are asking questions that sound almost like accusations. How long, O Lord? Why have you hidden your face? Where are you? These are not polished, composed prayers designed to impress. They are raw expressions of a heart that is trying to reconcile what it feels with what it believes. And this is where the tension becomes important. Because if faith were the same as feelings, these psalms would be evidence of instability, of inconsistency, even of spiritual failure. But they are not presented that way. They are preserved as scripture, as part of the very voice of God's people, which means they are not examples of faith breaking down. They are examples of faith in motion. They show what it looks like to continue engaging with God, even when the emotional experience is chaotic, even when nothing inside feels settled or certain. David, one of the primary voices in the Psalms, embodies this tension in a way that is almost disorienting. He can move from deep distress to confident trust within the same prayer, not because his circumstances have suddenly changed, but because he is actively choosing where to anchor himself. In one moment, he describes feeling overwhelmed, surrounded, abandoned, and in the next, he declares that God is his refuge, his rock, his salvation. To a modern reader, this might feel contradictory, but in the biblical framework, it is something else entirely. It is the coexistence of emotion and trust, the recognition that feelings can be real without being ultimate. This is where another key Hebrew word helps clarify what is happening beneath the surface. The word batach is often translated as trust, but it carries the sense of leaning on something, of placing your weight on it, of depending on it for support. It is not a passive concept, it is an active posture. When the psalmists speak of trusting God, they are not describing a vague sense of optimism or a fleeting emotional confidence. They are describing a deliberate act of reliance, a decision to rest the weight of their lives on the character of God, even when their internal state feels unstable. And this distinction changes everything, because it means that the presence of strong, even overwhelming emotion, does not disqualify faith. In fact, it often becomes the context in which faith is most clearly expressed. When a person feels calm and confident, trust can seem almost automatic. But when a person feels afraid, confused, or abandoned, and still turns toward God, still speaks to Him, still leans on Him, that is where faith reveals its depth. It is not that emotion disappears, but that it is brought into relationship with something greater than itself. Psalms also draw a subtle but important line between having emotions and being ruled by them. The writers do not deny what they feel, but they do not allow those feelings to dictate the final direction of their lives. They begin with honesty, but they move toward remembrance. They start with questions, but they return to truth. Again and again you see this pattern: a cry, a complaint, a description of distress followed by a deliberate shift. But I will trust, but I will remember, but you are. This movement is not driven by a sudden emotional change. It is driven by a conscious reorientation, a choice to place trust in God's character, rather than in the immediate evidence of their senses. This is where many people today find themselves confused because they have been taught implicitly or explicitly that authenticity means aligning completely with what they feel in the moment. If they feel distant, they assume they are distant. If they feel uncertain, they assume their faith is uncertain. If they feel nothing, they assume nothing is there. But the Psalms challenge that assumption in a profound way. They show that feelings can be accurate reflections of experience, but they are not always accurate interpreters of reality. They tell you what it is like to be in a moment, but they do not always tell you what is ultimately true beyond that moment. And this is where Ethan's experience begins to fit into a much larger story, because sitting in his truck feeling nothing while the music plays, he is not outside the biblical pattern, he is stepping into it, even if he doesn't realize it yet. The difference is that he has been measuring his faith by a standard the Bible never sets. He has been asking, do I feel something, when the deeper question has always been, where am I placing my trust right now? And because he cannot feel what he expects to feel, he assumes something is wrong, that his faith is fading or broken. But what if the absence of feeling is not the absence of faith, but the removal of something that was never meant to define it in the first place? The Psalms do not promise that emotions will always resolve neatly, or that every prayer will end in immediate peace. There are Psalms that end in unresolved darkness, where the tension is not tied up with a comforting conclusion. And yet, even there, something remarkable remains. The conversation with God does not stop. The relationship is not abandoned. The voice continues, even if it trembles, even if it questions, even if it struggles to find clarity. And that continuation, that refusal to turn away, is itself an expression of faith. This prepares the way for something even more defined in the New Testament, where the language of faith becomes sharper, more focused, and more directly tied to the person of Jesus. Because while the Psalms show that faith can exist alongside every kind of emotion, the life and teaching of Jesus will begin to show even more clearly what faith is anchored in and how it functions when emotions are unstable or absent. The question will shift from not only how faith coexists with feeling, but what faith actually is at its core, and whether it can remain real even when the internal experience feels completely empty. And as that question unfolds, it will begin to expose something that challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions many people carry, without realizing it, that strong faith should feel strong. Because what the New Testament will show again and again is that the people closest to Jesus often felt the opposite: fear, confusion, doubt, even failure. And yet somehow their faith was not defined by those feelings, but by something deeper, something more stable, something that did not rise and fall with the emotional weather inside them. The shift from the Psalms into the world of Jesus does not remove this tension between faith and feeling, it intensifies it. Because now, instead of reading poetry about trust in the middle of uncertainty, you are watching real people stand face to face with the one they believe is the Son of God, and still experience fear, confusion, and emotional collapse. If faith were meant to feel strong all the time, this is where you would expect to see it. And yet, what you actually see is something far more human, far more unsettling, and at the same time, far more revealing about what faith truly is. Picture the scene on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are not beginners. They have seen Jesus heal the sick, cast out demons, speak with authority in ways no one else can. They have already made the decision to follow him, to leave behind their previous lives and step into something they do not fully understand. And then a storm rises. Not a mild disturbance, but a violent, life-threatening storm that overwhelms even experienced fishermen. The waves crash, the wind howls, and suddenly everything they know feels fragile. In that moment, their emotional world is not calm, not confident, not grounded. It is filled with fear. They panic. They wake Jesus with words that carry both desperation and accusation. Don't you care that we're perishing? If faith were measured by emotional stability, this would be a failure. Their fear would be evidence that their trust is weak or absent. But notice what Jesus does and does not do. He calms the storm, yes, but then he turns to them and asks a question that cuts deeper than their fear. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? The question is not meant to shame their emotions, as if feeling fear itself were the problem. The deeper issue is what their fear reveals about what they are trusting in that moment. The storm has become more real to them than the presence of the one they are with. Their feelings are responding to what they see, what they hear, what they experience physically, and those feelings are powerful, immediate, overwhelming. But faith, as Jesus begins to expose it, is not about eliminating that emotional response. It is about whether trust remains anchored in him, even when those emotions surge. This pattern repeats itself in different forms throughout the Gospels. The disciples misunderstand, they hesitate, they argue about who is greatest. They struggle to grasp what Jesus is saying, even after hearing it multiple times. And again, if faith were defined by clarity of feeling or consistency of understanding, their story would look like a series of failures. But that is not how it is framed. Instead, their journey reveals that faith is something deeper than emotional certainty or intellectual completeness. It is a relationship of trust that develops over time, often through confusion, often through moments that do not feel stable or secure. Nowhere is this more evident than in the final hours before the crucifixion. As Jesus enters the Garden of Gethsemane, the emotional weight of what is about to happen presses in with an intensity that is almost unbearable. He speaks of his soul being overwhelmed with sorrow, even to the point of death. This is not a detached, emotionally neutral moment. This is anguish. This is distress. And yet, within that anguish, you hear something that reveals the core of faith in its purest form. Not my will, but yours be done. The feeling does not disappear. The struggle is not denied. But the trust remains anchored not in the absence of emotion, but in submission to the will and character of the Father. At the same time, the disciples who have walked with Jesus, who have seen his power, who have heard his teaching, begin to unravel emotionally. They fall asleep when they are asked to stay awake. They scatter when he is arrested. Peter, one of the most outspoken and confident among them, denies even knowing Jesus when fear overtakes him. These are not moments of calm, steady faith expressed through strong feelings. These are moments of weakness, of fear, of collapse. And yet, even here, the story does not end with the conclusion that their faith was never real. Instead, it shows that faith can exist even when it is mixed with failure, that trust can be present even when emotions overwhelm and actions falter. This is where the New Testament begins to give more precise language to what has been unfolding throughout the biblical story. The Greek word often used for faith is pistis, and like its Hebrew counterpart, it carries meanings that go beyond what many people assume. It includes trust, reliance, fidelity, a kind of loyalty that is expressed not just in what you feel, but in how you orient your life. It is relational at its core. It is about who you are relying on, who you are aligning yourself with, who you are, depending on when everything else becomes uncertain. And this begins to challenge one of the most deeply embedded assumptions in modern thinking, that faith is strongest when it feels strongest, because what you see in the lives of the disciples is something very different. You see faith that coexists with fear, with misunderstanding, with emotional instability. You see people who are learning slowly and often painfully that following Jesus does not mean they will always feel confident or secure. In fact, it often means the opposite. It means stepping into situations where their feelings are exposed as unreliable, where their instincts are challenged, where they are forced to confront the gap between what they feel and what they are being called to trust. And this brings us back again to Ethan, because sitting in his truck feeling nothing while the music plays, he assumes that something essential has been lost. He assumes that because the emotional response is gone, the faith must be fading with it. But what if the disciples had made the same assumption? What if Peter, after denying Jesus, had concluded that his fear meant his faith was never real? What if the moments of confusion, of panic, of emotional collapse were taken as final proof that something fundamental was missing? The Gospels do not support that conclusion. Instead, they reveal that faith is not measured by the absence of emotional struggle, but by what a person ultimately returns to what they continue to rely on even after failure, even after fear. After the resurrection, Jesus does not discard his disciples because of their weakness. He restores them. He meets them again, not because they have achieved perfect emotional consistency, but because their relationship with him is still intact, because their trust, however imperfect, is still directed toward him. And this begins to sharpen the question in a way that becomes impossible to ignore. If faith is not the same as feelings, if it can exist in the middle of fear, confusion, and even failure, then what exactly is it? What is the substance of faith when you strip away the emotional layer that so many people assume defines it? What remains when the internal sense of certainty is gone, when the emotional reinforcement disappears, when all that is left is the question of whether you will trust what God has said? The New Testament does not leave that question unanswered. In fact, it brings it into focus in one of the most well-known passages in all of Scripture, a passage that many people have heard, but few have fully understood. Because when it describes faith, it does not point to a feeling to be generated, but to something far more solid, far more grounded, something that can hold even when everything inside you feels uncertain. And it is there in that description that the foundation of faith becomes clear, in a way that has the power to reshape how you understand your own experience, especially in the moments when your feelings seem to disappear. By the time you arrive at Hebrews 11, the Bible does something that feels almost like a direct answer to the tension that has been building from the very beginning. All the stories, all the prayers, all the moments of fear and trust and confusion begin to converge into a single defining statement about what faith actually is. And at first glance, it is a verse that many people think they already understand. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. But if you read it slowly, and more importantly, if you read it in light of everything that has come before you, begin to realize that it is not describing an emotional state. It is describing a kind of grounded reality that exists beneath emotion. The word translated as assurance is the Greek word hypostasis. It carries a sense of substance, foundation, something that stands under and supports everything else. It is not fragile, not fleeting, not dependent on internal fluctuation. It is what gives something its stability, its realness. And this is where the common misunderstanding begins to unravel, because many people hear assurance and think of a strong feeling of confidence, a kind of inner certainty that rises up and makes everything feel clear. But that is not what the word is pointing to. It is pointing to something objective, something that exists whether or not you feel it in a given moment. Faith, in this sense, is not the feeling of certainty, it is the grounding of your life in something that is certain. The second word translated as conviction is elegchos. It refers to proof, evidence, a kind of inner recognition of truth that is anchored in something real. Again, this is not about generating a feeling of confidence. It is about being persuaded by something that has weight, something that holds even when your internal state does not cooperate. Together, these words paint a picture of faith that is far more substantial than many people expect. Faith is not pretending something is true until you feel it strongly enough. It is responding to something that is already true, even when you cannot see it, even when you cannot feel it, even when everything around you seems to suggest otherwise. And this is exactly what the rest of Hebrews 11 begins to demonstrate. It does not give you a list of people who felt confident all the time. It gives you a list of people who acted on God's word before the outcome was visible, before the promise was fulfilled, before the emotional reinforcement was guaranteed. Abel offers a sacrifice, not because he feels a certain way, but because he trusts what has been revealed. Noah builds an ark when there is no visible reason to do so, no immediate evidence that what he has been told will actually happen. Abraham leaves his homeland again without a map, without a timeline, without the kind of clarity that would make the journey feel safe or predictable. What ties all of these stories together is not emotional intensity, it is orientation. Their lives are oriented around the trustworthiness of God's word. They move, they act, they decide, based on something that exists outside of their immediate experience. And in many cases, that action would not have been accompanied by a strong feeling of certainty. If anything, it likely would have been accompanied by questions, by hesitation, by moments where the internal sense of clarity wavered. But faith, as Hebrews presents it, does not require the absence of those experiences. It requires that they are not what ultimately determines your direction. This is where the idea becomes both challenging and freeing at the same time. Because if faith were defined by how certain you feel, then any fluctuation in your emotions would immediately put your faith into question. Every moment of doubt, every season of dryness, every experience of numbness would become evidence that something is wrong. But Hebrews 11 does not allow for that kind of definition. Instead, it shows that faith can exist in the middle of uncertainty, that it can persist even when the outcome is delayed, even when the visible world does not yet reflect what has been promised. In fact, some of the most striking examples in the chapter are those where the fulfillment does not even occur within the person's lifetime. They act, they trust, they move forward, and they do not see the final result. If faith were dependent on emotional reinforcement or visible confirmation, these stories would collapse under their own weight, but they don't. Because the focus is not on what is felt or even on what is immediately seen. The focus is on the character of the one who has spoken, on the reliability of God himself. And this begins to expose something that is easy to miss but incredibly important. Faith is not self-generated strength. It is not something you produce by trying harder to feel convinced. It is a response to something outside of you, something that has already been established. This is why the object of faith matters so much, something that will become even clearer as we continue. Because the strength of faith is not measured by how strongly you feel it, but by what you are placing it in. A small, trembling trust placed in something solid can hold far more weight than a strong, confident feeling placed in something unstable. This brings us back once again to the question that has been quietly growing beneath the surface. What happens when you feel weak? What happens when your emotions are not reinforcing your belief? When your inner world feels uncertain, anxious, or even empty? According to the framework of Hebrews 11, those moments do not disqualify faith. They reveal where faith is actually anchored. Because when the feeling is gone, what remains is not nothing. It is the underlying question of what you are trusting, what you are relying on, what you are building your life around. And this is where the distinction that many people miss becomes crucial. There is a difference between doubt and emotion, between unbelief and the natural fluctuations of human experience. Feeling uncertain is not the same as refusing to trust. Feeling afraid is not the same as turning away. And as the New Testament continues to unfold, it will make that distinction more explicit, showing that faith can be present even when it is mixed with weakness, even when it is expressed through a voice that trembles, even when it reaches out with hesitation rather than confidence. Because the reality is not all struggles with feeling are the same. Some are moments of emotional fluctuation, the natural response to changing circumstances. Others are deeper questions about whether God can be trusted at all, and the Bible does not treat these as identical. It does not collapse everything into a single category of strong faith or no faith. Instead, it recognizes that a person can feel conflicted, can experience doubt, and still be moving toward God rather than away from Him. And that is where the story is about to turn in a way that becomes deeply personal. Because once you begin to see that faith is not the same as feeling, the next question becomes unavoidable. If I don't feel strong, if I don't feel certain, if I don't feel anything at all, can my faith still be real? Or does the absence of feeling mean something deeper is missing? The answer to that question is not theoretical. It is illustrated in one of the most honest, raw, and revealing moments in the Gospels, where a man stands in front of Jesus and says something that captures the tension perfectly. A sentence that holds both belief and struggle in the same breath. and in doing so, shows what faith can look like when it is not polished, not confident, but still reaching. There is a moment in the Gospels that is so honest, so unfiltered, that it almost feels out of place compared to how people often talk about faith. A man brings his suffering son to Jesus, desperate, exhausted, and unsure of what will happen next. He has already asked the disciples for help, and they could not heal the boy. Everything about his situation has likely worn down whatever confidence he once had. And when he finally stands in front of Jesus, what comes out of his mouth is not a polished declaration of certainty. It is something far more real, I believe. Help my unbelief. In that single sentence, you hear both trust and struggle, both movement toward Jesus and awareness of weakness. And what is remarkable is not just what he says, but how Jesus responds. He does not reject the man for his lack of perfect certainty. He meets him in that tension and acts. This moment forces a distinction that many people never fully make: the difference between doubt and unbelief, between emotional fluctuation and a settled refusal to trust. Because on the surface, both can feel similar, both can involve questions, hesitation, even a sense of internal conflict. But beneath the surface, they are fundamentally different. Doubt in the biblical sense often exists within the movement of faith. It is the struggle of a person who is still reaching, still engaging, still bringing their questions to God, rather than turning away from Him. Unbelief, on the other hand, is not simply the presence of questions or the absence of strong feeling. It is a resistance, a closing off, a refusal to trust, even when confronted with what has been revealed. The Greek word often used for unbelief, apistia, carries this sense of unfaithfulness, of not being persuaded, of rejecting trust. It is not describing a person who feels uncertain. It is describing a posture that chooses not to rely on God at all. And this is where the confusion often happens, because many people equate the absence of strong positive feeling with the presence of unbelief. They assume that if they feel anxious, if they feel numb, if they feel unsure, then something must be fundamentally broken in their faith. But the man in this story exposes that assumption as incomplete. He feels the tension, he acknowledges the struggle, and yet he still brings himself to Jesus. He still asks for help. His faith is not expressed through emotional certainty, but through the direction of his movement. This distinction matters because it reframes how you interpret your own internal experience. If every fluctuation in feeling is taken as evidence of failure, then faith becomes fragile, constantly under threat from the natural ups and downs of human emotion. But if faith is understood as trust directed toward God, even when that trust feels weak or conflicted, then those same fluctuations take on a different meaning. They become part of the context in which faith is exercised, not proof that it is absent. You can see this pattern throughout the Gospels, in the lives of the disciples. They experience fear, confusion, and misunderstanding repeatedly. They question what Jesus is doing. They struggle to grasp what He is saying. And yet they continue to follow Him. Their faith is not perfect, not consistent, not always accompanied by clarity or confidence. But it is real because it is oriented toward Him. Even when they falter, even when they fail, they return. And that return, that continued movement toward Jesus, reveals something deeper than the surface level of their emotions. This is where the idea becomes both deeply comforting and quietly challenging, because it means that a trembling, uncertain faith is still faith as long as it is reaching toward the right object. It means that you do not need to wait until you feel strong to come to God. You do not need to resolve every question or eliminate every doubt before your trust can be considered real. At the same time, it also means that faith cannot be reduced to a vague sense of spirituality or emotional openness. It is not simply about feeling something, anything, and calling that faith. It is about who you are trusting, where you are directing your reliance, what you are choosing to lean on when everything else feels unstable. This brings us back to Ethan in a way that begins to shift the weight of his experience. Sitting in his truck feeling nothing while the music plays, he assumes that his lack of emotion means his faith is fading. But what if the more important question is not what he feels, but what he is doing with that feeling? Is he turning away, concluding that none of this is real? Or is he still there, still listening, still wrestling with the question of what is true? Because if he is still there, still engaging, still asking then what he is experiencing may not be unbelief at all. It may be something much closer to what that man in the gospel expressed, a mixture of belief and struggle, of faith that is not polished but is still reaching. And this is where another subtle shift begins to take place. Because once you see that faith can coexist with doubt, that it can exist even when it feels weak or conflicted, the focus begins to move away from the intensity of your internal experience and toward something else entirely. It begins to move toward the object of your faith, toward what you are actually trusting in. Because ultimately, the question is not just whether you have faith, but what that faith is placed in. Is it placed in your ability to feel certain, in your ability to maintain emotional consistency, in the outcomes you hope to see, or is it placed in the character of God Himself? This question is not theoretical. It determines whether faith can survive when feelings collapse. Because if your faith is rooted in your internal state, then it will rise and fall with that state. But if it is rooted in something outside of you, something more stable than your emotions, then it can remain even when those emotions shift or disappear. And this is where the Bible begins to draw the conversation to its most critical point. Because once you understand that faith is not the same as feeling, and that it can exist even in the presence of doubt, the next step is to understand what gives that faith its strength in the first place. Because not all faith is the same. It is not the size or intensity of faith that ultimately determines its stability. It is the object it rests on. And as a story continues, that truth will begin to reshape everything, revealing why some forms of faith collapse under pressure, while others endure even when they feel small, even when they feel fragile, even when they feel like almost nothing at all. There's a quiet shift that changes everything once you begin to understand that faith is not the same as feelings. Because if faith is not measured by how strongly you feel, then the real question becomes much more precise, much more confronting, and at the same time much more freeing. What is your faith actually resting on? Not how intense it is, not how consistent it feels, but what it is placed in. Because the truth is, faith by itself is not automatically powerful. It only becomes stable when the object it rests on is stable. A strong feeling placed in something fragile will eventually collapse, while even a weak, trembling trust placed in something solid can hold. This is where many people, without realizing it, build their faith on the wrong foundation. Some place their faith in faith itself, believing that if they can just feel strongly enough, believe hard enough, or maintain enough internal certainty, everything will hold together. But that kind of faith is exhausting because it turns inward. It constantly monitors itself, constantly asks, do I feel strong enough? Do I believe enough? And the moment those feelings fluctuate, as they always do, it begins to crumble. Others place their faith in outcomes, in the expectation that if God is real, things should work out in a certain way. Prayers should be answered in visible ways. Life should align with what they hoped for. And when those outcomes don't come, or come differently than expected, their faith begins to shake, not because God has changed, but because their trust was anchored in results rather than in Him. But the Bible consistently redirects attention away from both of these and towards something far more stable, the character of God Himself. Not your feelings about Him, not what you think He might do next, but who He has revealed Himself to be. This is where the Old Testament word "He said" becomes so important. It speaks of God's steadfast love, His covenant loyalty, a love that does not shift with human inconsistency, a commitment that does not rise and fall with emotional conditions. It is not fragile. It is not reactive. It is enduring, steady, and rooted in His own nature. And this is what begins to reframe everything. Because if your faith is anchored in something that does not change, then your faith does not have to collapse every time your feelings do. It means that on the days when you feel nothing, when your prayers feel empty, when your worship feels distant, the foundation beneath you has not moved. The silence you feel is real, but it is not ultimate. Your emotional state may shift, but the object of your faith remains the same. This is where Ethan's perspective begins to change, even if only slightly at first. Sitting in his truck, he had been measuring everything by what he felt, assuming that the absence of emotion meant the absence of faith. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a different question begins to form. Not, why don't I feel anything, but what am I actually trusting right now? And that question does something his feelings could not. It redirects his attention away from himself and towards something more stable. Because the truth is, faith does not survive because it feels strong. It survives because it is anchored in something strong. This is why the Bible repeatedly points back to God's past faithfulness, to his promises, to his character revealed over time. Abraham trusted not because he always felt certain, but because he came to believe that God was trustworthy. Job held on not because his circumstances improved, but because he refused to let go of who he knew God to be, even when everything around him contradicted it. Mary said yes to something she did not fully understand, not because she felt completely ready, but because she trusted the one who had spoken to her. And this begins to reshape how you understand your own experience. Because if your faith feels weak, the instinct is often to try to strengthen the feeling, to generate more certainty, more emotion, more intensity. But the Bible points in a different direction. It points you not inward, but outward, not to the strength of your belief, but to the reliability of the one you believe in. And that shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it means that even a small, fragile trust can be real, can be enough if it is placed in something that does not break. This also begins to change how you approach ordinary moments, prayer, worship, obedience, especially when they feel empty. Because instead of asking, "Do I feel connected?" the question becomes, "Am I still trusting?" Instead of waiting for a certain emotional state before you act, you begin to act based on what you know to be true, even if your emotions lag behind. And over time, that kind of faith becomes steady, not because it always feels strong, but because it is no longer dependent on feeling strong in the first place. And this is where the image becomes clear. It is the difference between standing on thin ice and standing on solid ground. When you stand on thin ice, every movement feels risky, every crack makes you question whether you will hold. But when you stand on bedrock, your footing does not depend on how confident you feel, it depends on what is beneath you. You may still feel uncertain, you may still feel hesitant, but the ground itself does not shift under your feet. So the question is no longer whether your faith feels strong. The question is whether it is standing on something that is strong, because if it is, then it can endure the silence, the numbness, the fluctuation of emotion. It can continue even when nothing inside you seems to support it. And that is what makes it real, not the intensity of the feeling, but the stability of the foundation. And once that begins to settle in, it naturally leads to the next question, one that moves from understanding into daily life. What does it actually look like to live this way? Not just to believe it in theory, but to walk through ordinary days, work, family, stress, unanswered prayers, without relying on what you feel in the moment, but on something deeper, something unseen, something that holds even when everything inside you feels quiet. When the Apostle Paul writes that we walk by faith, not by sight, he is not just making a poetic statement. He is describing a completely different way of living, one that runs against almost every natural instinct we have. Because sight in the biblical sense is not just what you see with your eyes. It includes everything that feels immediate, measurable, and emotionally convincing. It includes circumstances, outcomes, and even your internal state, what feels real to you in the moment. And the problem is, those things are constantly changing. They rise and fall, shift and fluctuate, sometimes within the same day. If your life is built on that, then your sense of stability will rise and fall with it. But when Paul talks about walking by faith, he uses a word that implies movement, peripateo, to walk, to keep going, to conduct your life step by step. This is not about having one powerful moment of belief. It is about how you live on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing feels dramatic, when no strong emotion is carrying you forward. It is about continuing to move in a certain direction, based on what God has said, not based on what you currently feel or see. This becomes especially clear when you look at Paul's own life. He speaks openly about weakness, about pressure, about moments where everything feels heavy and uncertain. He does not present a version of faith that removes struggle or replaces it with constant emotional strength. Instead, he describes a kind of endurance that exists alongside weakness, a way of living that does not depend on feeling strong in order to keep going. In fact, some of his most powerful statements about faith come in the context of limitation, where the visible reality does not look impressive, where the internal experience is not marked by overwhelming confidence. And this is where the idea begins to connect directly to everyday life, because most of life does not feel dramatic. Most days are not filled with intense spiritual moments or overwhelming emotional clarity. Most days are quiet, repetitive, sometimes even numb. You wake up, you go to work, you deal with responsibilities, you face small frustrations, you carry unspoken worries, and in those moments, the question of faith is not, do I feel inspired? It is, will I keep walking in trust even when nothing inside me feels like it? This is where many people quietly struggle because they have been conditioned to associate faith with emotional elevation. They expect that if their faith is real, it will feel alive, active, noticeable. And when those feelings are not present, they assume something is wrong. But Paul's framework suggests something very different. It suggests that faith is most often expressed not in moments of emotional intensity, but in quiet consistency, in continuing to pray when it feels routine, in choosing honesty when it would be easier to avoid it, in holding on to truth when circumstances suggest something else. And this does not mean that emotions are irrelevant or unimportant. They are part of the human experience, and the Bible never asks you to ignore them. But it does place them in a different role. They are no longer the driver. They are part of the environment. They can influence how the journey feels, but they do not determine where the journey goes. Faith, in this sense, is what keeps you moving when the emotional landscape changes, when the sense of clarity fades, when the internal reinforcement is not there. This is where Ethan's situation begins to look different in a very practical way. Sitting in his truck, feeling nothing, he had assumed that the lack of emotion meant he had stopped moving forward spiritually. But what if the opposite is possible? What if he can still walk by faith even in that silence? What if continuing to turn toward God, even without feeling anything, is not a sign of failure, but a sign of something deeper beginning to form? Because when the emotional support is gone, what remains is the decision itself. The choice to keep trusting, to keep showing up, to keep orienting your life around something that is not dependent on how you feel in that moment. And this is where faith becomes something much more grounded than many people expect. It becomes daily embodied trust. Not dramatic, not always visible, not always emotionally satisfying, but steady. It looks like small decisions repeated over time, choices that align with what you believe to be true, even when those choices are not reinforced by immediate feeling. And over time, that kind of faith develops a kind of resilience, not because it has learned how to feel strongly all the time, but because it has learned how to remain when feelings change. So the question shifts again, but this time into something very practical. Not, do I feel close to God right now? But am I still walking toward Him? Not, do I feel certain, but am I still trusting what He has said? Because walking by faith is not about achieving a certain emotional state. It is about continuing in a direction step by step, even when the path feels quiet, even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening inside. And once that becomes clear, it opens the door to something that many people have been missing. Because if faith can exist in the ordinary, in the quiet, in the emotionally uneventful parts of life, then it means that those moments are not empty. They are not wasted. They are the very place where faith is lived out, where it becomes real, where it takes shape in ways that do not depend on feeling, but on trust. And that realization begins to change how you see your own life, not as a series of highs and lows defined by emotion, but as a steady movement grounded in something deeper, something unseen, something that holds, even when everything inside you feels still. Most people don't lose their faith in a dramatic moment. It doesn't usually collapse in a crisis or disappear in a single decision. More often it fades quietly in ordinary life, in long weeks of routine, in unanswered prayers, in mornings where nothing feels different, no matter how many times you try. It fades in the gap between what you expected faith to feel like and what it actually feels like most of the time. And for many people, that gap creates a quiet conclusion. They don't always say out loud, something must be wrong with me, because you were told directly or indirectly that real faith feels alive, that it feels strong, consistent, emotionally present. So when your reality looks different, when your prayers feel repetitive, when worship feels distant, when your inner world feels flat, you begin to assume that your faith itself is weak or even gone. But what if the problem is not your faith, but the definition you've been using to measure it? Because if everything we've seen is true, then biblical faith often looks nothing like what people expect. It is not always dramatic. It is not always emotionally intense. In fact, from the outside, it can look almost unimpressive. It looks like continuing to pray when you don't feel anything. It looks like choosing honesty when it would be easier to avoid it. It looks like holding on to what God has said, even when your circumstances haven't changed. It looks quiet, steady, and sometimes even invisible. And that means something incredibly important for you right where you are. It means that the days you thought didn't count, the days that felt flat, the moments that felt empty, may actually be the very place where your faith is most real. Not because you feel strong, but because you continue anyway. Not because you are carried by emotion, but because you are anchored in something deeper than emotion. So instead of trying to fix your feelings, the invitation is to shift your focus. Not inward, but outward. Not toward how you feel, but toward what is true. And that shift begins with something very practical. First, anchor your prayers in Scripture before you anchor them in your mood. Because your mood will change sometimes quickly, sometimes without warning. But the words of Scripture remain steady. When you don't know what to say, when your feelings feel disconnected, let those words carry you. Not as a performance, not as a routine, but as a way of grounding your trust in something more stable than your internal state. Second, practice honest prayer instead of polished prayer. The Bible never asks you to pretend. It never asks you to hide what you feel or to dress it up into something more acceptable. If you feel nothing, say that. If you feel confused, say that. If you feel distant, say that. Because faith is not built on pretending to feel something you don't. It is built on bringing your real experience into relationship with God, even when that experience feels incomplete or uncertain. Third, choose one clear act of obedience this week, even if your emotions are not aligned with it. Something simple, something concrete, because faith is not just what you think or feel, it is how you live. And when you act on what you know to be true, even in small ways, you begin to reinforce the foundation your faith is built on, not by generating feeling, but by practicing trust. And this is where everything begins to come together, in a way that is both quiet and powerful. Because you start to realize that faith was never meant to be sustained by emotional intensity. It was meant to be sustained by trust, and trust by its nature does not always feel dramatic. It is often steady, consistent, almost ordinary. But that does not make it weak. In many ways, it makes it stronger. So if you are in a season where you feel nothing, where your inner world feels quiet, or even empty, it does not mean your faith is gone. It may mean your faith is being stripped down to what actually holds, and what remains in that place. If you continue to trust even quietly, even imperfectly, may be more real, more stable, and more meaningful than anything you felt before. And that realization leads to one final question, one that brings everything full circle. What happens when the feelings do come back? And what happens when they don't? Because the answer to that will determine whether your faith remains dependent on what you feel, or whether it has finally found something deeper to stand on. A few days later, Ethan is back in his truck again. Same seat, same silence, same song playing softly in the background. But something is different this time, not in what he feels, but in how he understands it. The numbness is still there. The emotion still hasn't returned, but the panic is gone. The quiet fear that something was broken inside him has loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier, something less dramatic, but more grounded. Because now, instead of asking, "Why don't I feel anything?" he's asking a different question. Am I still trusting? And that shift changes everything, because the truth is, sometimes the feelings do come back. Sometimes there are moments where prayer feels alive again, where worship stirs something deep, where the sense of connection feels real and present. And those moments are gifts. They were never meant to be ignored or dismissed. They are part of the relationship, part of the human experience of knowing God. But they were never meant to carry the weight of your faith. They were never meant to be the foundation. And sometimes the feelings don't come back, at least not in the way you expect, or not as quickly as you hoped. There are seasons where faith feels quiet, where your inner world remains steady but unspectacular, where nothing dramatic seems to happen inside you at all. And those seasons are not evidence that something is wrong. They are often the place where something deeper is being formed, something less dependent on emotional reinforcement and more anchored in trust. Because emotions, as real and meaningful as they are, were never designed to lead. They were designed to respond. They rise and fall, they shift with circumstances, they reflect what you're experiencing in the moment. But faith, as the Bible presents it, is not built on something that unstable. It is built on something that does not move when everything else does. This is what Ethan begins to understand, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. He doesn't suddenly become a different person. He doesn't wake up the next morning overflowing with emotion, but he starts to approach things differently. He prays without trying to manufacture a feeling. He listens without expecting a certain emotional response. He shows up not because it feels powerful, but because he has begun to trust that what he is doing still matters, even when it feels quiet. And that kind of faith, almost unnoticed at first, begins to grow roots. Not the kind that produce immediate visible results, but the kind that hold when pressure comes, when feelings fluctuate, when life becomes uncertain again. It is not flashy. It is not dramatic, but it is real. And that is where everything comes together. Because at the end of all of this, the goal was never to eliminate emotion or to pretend it doesn't matter. The goal was to put it in its proper place, to recognize that feelings are part of faith, but they are not the foundation of it. They are a gift, not a guide. They belong in the relationship, but they do not sit on the throne. So if you are in a season where your faith feels quiet, where your emotions are not lining up with what you believe, you are not alone, and you are not broken. You may be standing in the exact place where faith becomes what it was always meant to be. Not the pulse of your feelings, but the placement of your trust. And that is the line to hold on to, the one that remains. Even when everything else feels uncertain, faith is not how strongly you feel, it is where you stand when your feelings are gone.